Far away, in a quiet corner of the galaxy, a world thrived with life unlike anything humans had ever seen. Its skies shimmered with colors that changed with every passing hour, and its forests glowed softly under the twin moons. The creatures that lived there were clever and graceful, each adapted perfectly to the strange rhythms of their planet. Life seemed peaceful, but appearances were deceptive. Beneath the beauty, the planet was quietly dying. Its oceans were warming at an alarming rate. The forests were wilting faster than new trees could grow, and storms had begun to appear without warning, tearing through cities and villages alike. The leaders of this world were proud and intelligent beings. They had always solved their problems with careful thought, science, and teamwork. They had endured minor crises before, from small environmental shifts to sudden outbreaks of disease among their wildlife. But nothing in their history prepared them for what was coming. Their planet's ecosystem had reached a breaking point, and they realized that they might not have the knowledge or resources to fix it themselves. For years, scientists studied the signs. They measured the changes in air quality, in soil richness, and in water flow. They calculated probabilities and predicted outcomes, and in each calculation, the numbers became bleaker. Cities that had once thrived were now struggling to maintain food and energy. Communities were forced to move inland when floods swallowed their homes. Forests that had supported generations of creatures were shrinking into isolated patches. The leaders held emergency meetings daily, discussing every possible solution, but each solution had limits. They were experts in their world, but their planet was turning into a challenge even they could not master. Finally, the leaders made a decision that would change everything. They activated the distress signal, a message sent far beyond their solar system, reaching out to any civilization capable of traveling across the stars. It was not a small call for help. It was a message born from desperation. They encoded it carefully, hoping it would convey both the urgency of the situation and the intelligence of their people. They did not expect much. The universe was vast, and many species might ignore a distant planet's plea. Many might be too small, too weak, or simply uninterested. Even as they sent the signal, the leaders worried. They had seen stories in their own records of worlds reaching out for help, only to be ignored or misunderstood. Some messages had been met with curiosity, others with indifference. They had learned that asking for help was risky. A stranger might arrive bringing chaos instead of solutions, or worse, they might come with conditions that could harm the planet further. But their own options were running out. They had no choice. The signal traveled through the dark void of space, moving faster than the fastest ships of the alien fleets. It passed stars, planets, and entire systems, slipping past defenses and satellites, finally reaching places far beyond the borders of their galaxy. The message was clear. A civilization in danger needed help. But who would respond? And would they be capable of understanding the scale of the problem? Back on the planet, life continued as best it could. Children played near the glowing rivers, unaware of the storms brewing in distant clouds. Farmers worked in fields where crops struggled to grow, hoping that the soil would hold just a little longer. Scientists continued their measurements, trying to adapt and mitigate the disasters around them. Each day was a careful balance between hope and fear. They had prepared for emergencies, but not for a situation like this, where their world might not survive without outside help. At night, the leaders would gather in quiet rooms, looking at the stars. They wondered who might hear their call. Would it be a peaceful species, willing to help without taking advantage? Or would it be a race driven by its own ambitions, bringing more problems than solutions? They did not know, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on them. In a way, they envied the simplicity of the creatures that could not see the future, the animals that still played in the forest, unaware that their home was dying. Days turned into weeks. The distress signal continued to travel, crossing unimaginable distances. Some of the leaders doubted whether it would ever reach anyone, and yet they could not stop hoping. Even in despair, hope was all they had left. It was a strange, fragile thing, but it kept them moving, planning and preparing for whatever might arrive. Then, one day, an unusual ripple passed through the communication network. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A response. The leaders stared at the data, unable to believe what they were seeing. The message came from a species they had never known existed, one that lived under conditions far harsher than their own planet could ever imagine. These beings were not scholars or diplomats in the traditional sense. They were survivors, hardened by endless challenges and capable of enduring what no other species could. The leaders felt a mix of emotions: relief, curiosity, and a strange sense of fear. They had expected aid from an advanced but cautious civilization. They had not expected to attract beings who thrived in danger itself, who were forged by harsh worlds and unyielding environments. Their instincts told them to prepare carefully, to assume the worst even while hoping for the best. They did not know whether these new visitors would be saviors, or if their presence would bring more chaos to an already fragile world. Preparations began immediately. The alien leaders set protocols, cleared areas for potential landing zones, and instructed their people to be cautious. Scientists monitored every fluctuation in the planet's atmosphere, every potential hazard, and every signal coming from the distant approach. Everyone worked with urgency, knowing that the arrival of these unknown beings could change everything. And yet, there was an unspoken understanding among them all. This might be the only chance to save their world. As the days passed, tension grew. The leaders discussed scenarios they had never imagined, from successful rescue to complete disaster. They trained volunteers, equipped shelters, and organized communities, all while keeping hope alive. Life continued around them, strange and fragile, as the people and creatures of the planet waited and watched the skies. Finally, on a quiet morning under the soft light of twin suns, a faint shimmer appeared on the horizon. It was unlike any ship they had ever seen, moving with precision and power. It did not approach slowly with caution like most visitors might. It moved with the confidence of beings who had faced impossible odds before. The alien leaders exchanged nervous glances, realizing that the moment they had prepared for had arrived. The beings from beyond the stars were here, and in that moment the aliens understood something profound. They had sent out a call for help, not knowing who would answer, and now something beyond their understanding was coming. They did not yet know whether these visitors would save their planet or challenge it in ways they could not predict. All they could do was watch, wait, and hope that the courage of these beings would match the peril their world faced. The planet held its breath, and so did its people. The first chapter of this unexpected story was about to begin, and no one, not even the leaders, could imagine the transformations that lay ahead. When the first shimmer of light appeared on the horizon, the aliens' hearts raced. They had waited for weeks watching the skies, hoping that help would arrive. Now it was clear. Help was coming, but it was unlike anything they could have imagined. The beings moving across their planet's skies did not resemble the peaceful, cautious species they had expected. Instead, they looked lean, strong, and strangely rugged, with bodies built to withstand environments far harsher than the aliens' own world. Every movement was confident and deliberate. There was no hesitation, no delicate approach. These beings were not afraid of the unknown. They thrived in it. The first sighting sparked panic among some of the aliens. They whispered about what kind of creatures these were, questioning whether they had sent their call to the right beings. Were these strangers dangerous? Could they survive their planet's harsh conditions without destroying themselves or the planet? Others, especially the leaders, reminded them that the very fact these beings had responded meant they had strength, intelligence, and courage beyond any ordinary species. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. As the newcomers descended, the aliens noticed how they interacted with the environment. Unlike the gentle, careful methods the aliens themselves used, these visitors moved with purpose and efficiency. They adjusted to the planet's gravity, navigated through difficult terrain, and adapted to sudden changes in temperature with ease. It was clear that nothing on this planet would stop them, even the most extreme weather or rough terrain, which had challenged generations of the planet's inhabitants, seemed almost trivial to these beings. The aliens gathered in observation points, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. They watched as the visitors split into teams, each moving in different directions across the terrain. They did not rely on advanced technology alone. Tools were used, yes, but their strength, skill, and instinct guided every action. Where an alien scientist would take careful measurements for hours before taking a step, the newcomers assessed the environment at a glance and moved forward. They were alive with energy, alert to every sound, every shadow, every movement of life around them. Some of the alien leaders tried to communicate. They transmitted greetings, introductions, and basic information about the planet and the problems it faced. The visitors listened attentively, their expressions unreadable, then nodded as if understanding something deeper than words could convey. They did not speak in the usual tones the aliens expected. Instead, their communication was subtle, made through gestures, looks, and actions. And yet it worked. The aliens felt an odd sense of reassurance. Somehow they understood that these beings had the capability to help, not in the polite, cautious way the aliens usually expected, but in a way that was practical, immediate, and effective. The first days were astonishing. The visitors identified areas of the planet where environmental hazards were the most dangerous. They built small temporary shelters in places where the storms were strongest, giving alien communities a safe place to wait out sudden disasters. They discovered sources of clean water hidden beneath the surface and cleared dangerous wildlife from populated areas. Each action was bold, decisive, and above all effective. The aliens could not keep up. They had studied these hazards for years, and yet the visitors seemed to solve problems faster than the aliens could even analyze them. What fascinated the aliens most was how the visitors adapted. When a sudden windstorm hit a coastal village, destroying temporary shelters, the visitors did not panic. Instead, they assessed the damage, salvaged usable materials, and built sturdier, safer structures in less than a day. The aliens had never seen such resilience. On their planet, disasters were frightening, often leaving entire communities immobilized. Here, the newcomers treated disaster like a challenge, a puzzle to solve rather than a threat to fear. The alien leaders began to realize that the visitors' strength was not just in their physical abilities. It was in their thinking, their creativity, and their willingness to act when others might hesitate. Where the aliens relied heavily on complex machines, the visitors relied on instinct, improvisation, and observation. They could assess a situation, adapt tools, and even invent new ways to survive in minutes. The aliens watched in awe as problems that had seemed insurmountable for generations were solved in hours. The creatures of the planet, too, responded differently to the visitors. Predators that had terrified the locals avoided these newcomers entirely. Some creatures even seemed curious, approaching cautiously but without fear. The visitors did not provoke the wildlife unnecessarily. Instead, they respected the natural balance while neutralizing the dangers that threatened human settlements. The aliens had never seen such a combination of strength and respect, efficiency and caution. Even as the visitors worked, the aliens began to notice something else. Their presence inspired the people of the planet. Communities that had been paralyzed by fear and despair began to take action themselves. They copied the visitors' methods, learning how to build, protect, and respond in ways they had never imagined. The planet's inhabitants were no longer waiting passively for rescue. They were learning, adapting, and surviving. In the visitors, they saw not just aid but example. The aliens observed quietly, learning from the visitors in turn. They saw that their assumptions had been wrong. They had believed that aid would come in the form of careful instructions, calculated solutions, or gentle guidance. Instead, they were witnessing a species that thrived in danger, that turned chaos into opportunity, and that never let fear paralyze action. They realized that what they had called help was something far greater, something that would change the planet's survival entirely. As the days passed, small victories began to mount. The visitors cleared a mountain pass that had been blocked by falling debris for years, allowing supply lines to reopen. They created rudimentary bridges across swollen rivers, saving villages that had been cut off for months. They even discovered ways to redirect some of the planet's unpredictable weather, or at least minimize its most dangerous effects. The aliens were astonished. What had seemed impossible for centuries was now being achieved in a matter of days. But it wasn't just their skill that impressed the aliens, it was their courage. While the aliens avoided hazardous areas, fearing the consequences, the visitors entered them without hesitation. They climbed cliffs that had crumbled under storms, waded through toxic swamps, and faced predators with no weapons other than their own strength and cleverness. The aliens began to whisper among themselves. These beings were not just capable, they were extraordinary, beyond anything their records had imagined. Despite all their achievements, the visitors remained humble. They did not boast, did not seek reward, and did not demand recognition. Every action was aimed at solving a problem, protecting life, or stabilizing the planet. They worked in silence with efficiency and patience, guided by instinct and experience rather than by pride. The aliens began to understand that this humility, combined with resilience, made the visitors all the more remarkable. By the end of the first week, the planet had changed. Streets that had been flooded or blocked were now passable. Communities that had been isolated were reconnected. Crops that had seemed doomed began to recover under the careful attention of both visitors and local residents. The aliens looked around in awe. They realized that this was no ordinary aid. It was transformation, radical, immediate, and effective. The alien leaders finally gathered to discuss what they had witnessed. Their pride had been humbled. They had expected polite assistance, careful solutions, and measured progress. Instead, they had seen action, courage, and results that defied expectation. They began to realize that the visitors had not just come to help. They had come to change the planet in ways that were impossible without them. And the aliens knew that this was only the beginning. These visitors, these Deathworlders, had arrived with more than tools. They had arrived with the strength, creativity, and spirit to face any danger. The aliens had sent a distress call expecting cautious assistance. What they had received was something far more powerful, a species that could survive anything, adapt to anything, and inspire those around them to do the same. The planet had seen the first proof that these beings were extraordinary. And as the sun set behind jagged mountains and glowing forests, the aliens understood something fundamental. Help had arrived, but not in the way they had imagined. It had arrived in the form of life that was forged by danger, sharpened by struggle, and tempered by the most extreme challenges imaginable. It was a force unlike anything they had known, and it had just begun. By the third day of their arrival, the visitors had already changed the rhythm of life on the planet. The aliens, who had watched cautiously at first, now followed their every move, learning and trying to understand how these beings worked. What fascinated them most was how the visitors approached problems. They didn't hesitate. They didn't waste time analyzing endlessly or waiting for perfect conditions. Instead, they acted with careful speed, always observing, always adapting, always ready for what might come next. The aliens decided to introduce the visitors to the planet's most dangerous regions. These were areas that had challenged even the strongest local inhabitants for generations. Deep forests with poisonous plants, mountains prone to sudden landslides, rivers that could turn violent without warning. For the aliens, these regions were places of caution and fear. Yet the visitors approached them as if they had walked through such dangers all their lives. The first challenge was the forest, a dense, almost impenetrable tangle of trees, vines, and strange plants. Many of these plants released toxins into the air when touched, and predators lurked in the shadows waiting for anything that moved. The aliens warned the visitors repeatedly, describing the dangers in precise, careful terms. But the visitors only listened briefly. They studied the environment with sharp eyes, touched plants lightly, observed animal tracks, and moved forward. Where an alien would stop to measure, map, and calculate for hours, the visitors relied on instinct, knowledge gained from experience, and careful observation. Within hours, they had mapped the safest paths, neutralized hazards, and even discovered hidden resources that had been ignored for centuries. The aliens were astonished. They had always assumed their knowledge of the forest was unmatched. But the visitors had not only understood it quickly, they had improved it, finding ways to use the forest's resources without endangering themselves or the local inhabitants. Small teams of visitors began teaching the aliens simple techniques: how to move silently, how to avoid dangerous plants, and how to detect predators before they could strike. The aliens absorbed this knowledge eagerly, realizing that these newcomers could do in hours what had taken generations to learn. The next challenge was the mountains. These jagged peaks were treacherous with crumbling rocks and unpredictable weather. Storms could appear without warning, sending rocks tumbling down and freezing winds howling through narrow passes. The alien leaders had always thought only specialized climbers could survive in these mountains, yet the visitors moved through them with astonishing agility. They built temporary shelters in rock crevices, rigged simple but effective safety measures, and even guided alien teams along routes that had previously been considered impassable. The aliens watched, speechless as the visitors seemed to anticipate every danger. When a sudden landslide occurred, they reacted instantly, pulling nearby aliens to safety and redirecting falling debris. Where the aliens would have panicked, delayed, or avoided the area entirely, The visitors remained calm, methodical, and decisive. Each success built confidence, not only among themselves but also among the alien populations who had been watching. For the first time, the aliens felt that survival was possible even in the most dangerous parts of their planet. Then came the rivers. Wide, fast-flowing rivers had long divided communities, making travel and trade difficult. They could swell in a single night, washing away bridges and flooding homes. The visitors examined the water carefully, testing currents, measuring depth, and observing patterns. Instead of waiting for tools or machines, they improvised solutions. Using nearby materials, they constructed temporary crossings that were strong, stable, and surprisingly elegant. They even showed the aliens how to build simple warning systems, alerting communities when water levels became dangerous. The aliens noticed something else about the visitors: their communication. Unlike the formal, slow methods the aliens usually used, the visitors communicated with efficiency and clarity. A glance, a hand gesture, or a subtle sound conveyed information instantly. This allowed them to coordinate in ways the aliens had never seen. Teams of visitors could split up, handle separate problems, and regroup seamlessly, all without confusion. The aliens realized that this was one of the reasons they could tackle so many challenges at once. Their efficiency wasn't just physical, it was mental, strategic, and deeply intuitive. Even the wildlife reacted differently to the visitors than to the aliens. Predators that had avoided humans for generations now gave the visitors a cautious distance, recognizing them as beings to be respected. Smaller creatures seemed curious rather than fearful, sometimes approaching to observe, never attacking. The visitors never harmed the wildlife unnecessarily. They moved with a balance of caution and respect, neutralizing only the threats that endangered the planet's inhabitants. The aliens watched carefully, learning how these beings could survive in harmony with a dangerous ecosystem rather than trying to dominate it. The visitors' approach to danger was perhaps the most remarkable lesson of all. While the aliens often reacted with fear, the visitors treated danger as a challenge, something to understand and manage. A poisonous plant was studied and avoided, a predator observed and redirected, a storm predicted and mitigated. Nothing was feared unnecessarily, and yet nothing was ignored. The visitors were calm, focused, and relentlessly practical, showing the aliens that courage and intelligence could overcome even the most terrifying obstacles. As the days passed, the aliens began to participate actively. They followed the visitors into forests, mountains, and rivers, learning by observation and imitation. The visitors taught them techniques for moving silently, detecting hazards, and using resources wisely. Where the aliens had once relied on machines and slow calculations, they now learned to trust instinct, creativity, and teamwork. Communities that had once been isolated by fear began to reconnect, exploring regions they had long avoided. Slowly, the planet itself seemed to breathe a little easier. The visitors also introduced new ways of thinking. Instead of seeing the planet's challenges as permanent obstacles, they encouraged the aliens to experiment, improvise, and adapt. They showed that solutions did not always have to be perfect. They only needed to be effective. Small successes, repeated consistently, could transform even the most dangerous situations. The aliens began to understand that survival wasn't just about knowledge, it was about action, adaptability, and courage. By the end of the third week, the planet had changed in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. Dangerous regions had been stabilized, communities that had been isolated were now accessible, and the aliens themselves were stronger, braver, and wiser. They had seen firsthand the visitors' abilities, and they had begun to understand a new way of approaching life. It wasn't just the physical skills that impressed them, it was the mindset, the resilience, and the ability to act decisively in the face of danger. For the first time, the aliens realized that their distress call had brought not just assistance, but transformation. They had expected careful, polite aid, something gentle and safe. Instead, they had received beings who could survive anything, adapt to anything, and inspire those around them to do the same. These visitors were not just helpers, they were teachers, leaders, and catalysts for change. And yet, even as the aliens admired them, they also understood that this was only the beginning. The planet still faced enormous threats, from unpredictable storms to dangerous wildlife. The visitors had shown what was possible, but the journey was far from over. The aliens knew that they would have to continue learning, adapting, and working alongside these remarkable beings to secure their world's survival. As night fell over the planet, the aliens reflected on what they had seen. The visitors had entered their world with confidence, courage, and skill. They had faced danger without hesitation, solved problems with creativity and intelligence, and taught the aliens lessons that could never be learned from books or machines. For the first time, the aliens understood that help could come in forms they had never imagined, and that sometimes the most extraordinary teachers were those who had lived through the harshest trials. In the quiet moments before sleep, the alien leaders looked up at the sky, imagining the vast journey these visitors had taken to reach them. They wondered how many challenges, dangers, and obstacles the visitors had already overcome, and they felt a deep sense of gratitude, respect, and awe. Their world had been changed forever, not just by survival, but by the arrival of beings who could see danger as opportunity, fear as challenge, and chaos as something to be mastered. The planet had begun to breathe easier, and its people had begun to hope again. The visitors had shown them that survival was possible, even in the harshest conditions, and that courage, ingenuity, and adaptability could overcome obstacles that once seemed insurmountable. And as the stars shone over forests, rivers, and mountains, the aliens knew that the true story of these extraordinary beings was only just beginning. By the fourth week, the visitors had become a constant presence across the planet. Their work was no longer limited to observation or small interventions. They had begun to transform the very way the planet functioned. Where danger had once ruled, they now brought order, method, and hope. The aliens watched closely, sometimes from a distance, sometimes standing alongside them, learning how to tackle challenges that had once seemed impossible. The first major effort was to stabilize the most extreme weather patterns. Storms had always been unpredictable, sometimes destroying entire villages without warning. Scientists had tried for decades to predict these storms, but the planet's weather was too chaotic, too volatile, and too powerful for their instruments alone. The visitors approached the problem differently. They observed patterns not with instruments but with careful attention to the environment. They noticed small signals, the movement of clouds, the behavior of animals, the subtle shifts in wind and temperature that humans would have considered insignificant. Using these observations, they developed simple methods to reduce risk. Temporary windbreaks were built in strategic locations, channels were dug to redirect floodwaters, and small shelters were positioned in areas less prone to lightning or debris. They taught the aliens how to react quickly when signs of a storm appeared, showing them that survival depended not only on preparation, but on calm, decisive action in the moment. The storms were still powerful, but thanks to the visitors, communities were no longer at the mercy of destruction. Next, the visitors turned their attention to the planet's wildlife. Predators that had long threatened villages were monitored and, when necessary, redirected without harm. Smaller animals that spread disease or consumed crops were gently guided away from human settlements. The visitors showed the aliens how to work with the natural balance rather than against it, and the aliens began to see the difference. Survival did not mean domination. It meant understanding, respect, and careful management. Villages that had once been isolated were now safer, and the planet's creatures were not harmed unnecessarily. The alien leaders began to recognize something else about the visitors. They inspired courage. The people of the planet, who had once been hesitant and fearful, began taking action themselves. Inspired by the visitors' boldness, they repaired bridges, cleared debris, and rebuilt homes. They learned to anticipate hazards, to act quickly, and to work as teams. The visitors taught by example, and the aliens responded, slowly transforming a population paralyzed by fear into a community that could face challenges with confidence. One of the greatest achievements during this period was the stabilization of food sources. Years of environmental change had caused crops to fail, leaving entire regions at risk of famine. The visitors assessed the land, identified areas that could be revitalized, and introduced simple but effective techniques. They showed how to protect young plants from extreme weather, how to rotate crops to prevent soil exhaustion, and how to use natural resources to boost growth. The aliens helped learning these methods quickly. Within weeks, fields that had been barren began to flourish, and communities that had feared hunger for months now had hope again. The visitors' ability to adapt to the planet's harshest conditions amazed the aliens. When a previously dormant volcano showed signs of activity, the visitors did not panic. They studied the situation, identified safe zones, and coordinated evacuations with precision. They even managed to create temporary barriers to redirect lava flow, reducing the threat to nearby settlements. The aliens had never imagined such effectiveness. What had seemed like an unstoppable force of nature was now something that could be understood, managed, and survived. Another remarkable feature was their teamwork. The visitors worked in coordinated units, each member knowing exactly what to do, yet flexible enough to adapt if conditions changed. They communicated efficiently with gestures, glances, and subtle sounds that the aliens could barely interpret at first. Yet the results were undeniable. Even when facing multiple crises at once, the visitors never faltered. Villages that had been cut off by floods, landslides, and storms were all assisted simultaneously. The aliens began to understand that the combination of skill, experience, and instinct was more powerful than the most advanced machines. The visitors also taught the aliens about improvisation. When faced with a sudden problem, a bridge washed out, a river rising faster than expected, or a roof collapsing under heavy rain, they showed that solutions did not have to be perfect to be effective. Small creative fixes applied quickly could prevent disasters and buy time until more permanent solutions could be established. The aliens, who had often hesitated in the face of uncertainty, began to adopt this approach. They learned to act with courage, adapt on the fly, and trust their instincts, and the results were transformative. As the visitors continued their work, the planet itself began to change. Rivers flowed more safely, forests became easier to navigate, and storms caused far less damage. Communities that had been struggling for years were now thriving. The aliens marveled at the speed of this transformation. Where it had once taken generations to repair the damage caused by nature, the visitors accomplished it in weeks. The planet was not only surviving, it was beginning to flourish under their guidance. One evening, as the sun set behind mountains and glowing forests, the aliens gathered to discuss the progress. They realized that they had underestimated the visitors from the start. They had expected polite assistance, careful and calculated interventions, but what they had received was far more. The visitors had not only solved problems, they had changed the very way the planet and its people approached survival. They had turned fear into courage, chaos into order, and despair into hope. Even the youngest members of the alien communities were learning from the visitors. Children who had once been sheltered from danger now observed and participated in safe, guided ways. They learned how to move cautiously through forests, how to predict weather patterns, and how to assist in community projects. The visitors taught not with lectures but by example, showing that courage and action were more powerful than fear and hesitation. In this way, the knowledge and skills of the visitors began to spread across generations, ensuring that the impact would last long after they departed. The visitors' humility was also remarkable. They did not boast about their achievements, nor did they seek recognition or reward. Every action was aimed at improving survival and reducing harm. They worked tirelessly, often in harsh conditions, yet always with patience and care. The aliens began to understand that this was part of what made them extraordinary. Their power was not only in strength or skill, but in their mindset, calm, focused, and guided by purpose rather than ego. By the end of the 4th week, the planet was almost unrecognizable from the way it had been when the visitors arrived. Dangerous regions were now accessible, weather-related disasters were less severe, and communities were more connected and resilient. The aliens had learned more in a month than they had in centuries about adaptation, courage, and survival. They saw that true change was not about controlling nature, but about understanding it, respecting it, and acting decisively in response to challenges. The alien leaders realized that their decision to send a distress call had not merely brought assistance, it had brought transformation. The visitors had arrived not only to help but to teach, inspire, and empower. They had shown that even the harshest conditions could be overcome with courage, skill, and teamwork. The planet was safer, its people stronger, and hope had returned in ways the aliens had never imagined possible. And yet, even as they celebrated these achievements, the alien leaders knew that more challenges lay ahead. The visitors had demonstrated what was possible, but the planet's future depended on continued vigilance, adaptation, and cooperation. The lessons they had learned in these weeks would guide them. But the real test of survival was ongoing. The visitors had sparked a transformation, but it was up to the planet's inhabitants to carry it forward. As the night settled over the planet, glowing forests and rivers reflecting the starlight, the aliens understood something fundamental. Help had come in a form far beyond their expectations. These beings, forged in harsh worlds and shaped by danger, had not only rescued them, they had shown them how to survive, thrive, and transform their own world. The visitors were not just allies, they were catalysts for a future they had never imagined, and their influence would endure for generations to come. By the 5th week, the visitors had already transformed much of the planet, but the most dangerous challenges were still ahead. Entire regions were unstable. Volcanic zones, unstable cliffs, and unpredictable storm belts continued to threaten life. The aliens, though inspired and hopeful, knew that these areas had never been successfully managed. Entire generations had avoided them, believing them untouchable. But the visitors moved forward without hesitation. To them, danger was not something to fear, it was something to face head-on, using skill, planning, and courage. The first major task was the volcanic region. The ground trembled constantly, and smoke rose in heavy clouds that poisoned the air. Past eruptions had destroyed villages, leaving scars across the landscape. Alien engineers and scientists had tried for decades to create barriers and evacuation systems, but nothing had worked. The visitors arrived surveying the volcanoes with sharp, steady eyes. They studied lava flows, gas emissions, and the shifting earth. Then, without waiting for long explanations, they began taking action. Teams of visitors moved carefully through the unstable terrain, placing temporary barriers to divert lava flows and create safe channels. They dug trenches to redirect poisonous gases and built shelters where villagers could gather safely. The aliens watched in amazement as the visitors navigated the rocky slopes with balance and precision, never hesitating even when the ground shook beneath them. Where the aliens had always been cautious and slow, the visitors were confident, methodical, and fearless. Their courage inspired not only the local communities, but also the aliens themselves, who had never seen such mastery over danger. Next came the unstable cliffs. Entire cities had been built near cliffs that were prone to sudden collapses. Landslides had claimed countless lives and rebuilding efforts had often failed. The visitors approached these areas as if they had climbed countless cliffs before. They assessed weaknesses in the rock, reinforced critical areas with simple but strong materials, and created safe paths for villagers to move. They even trained the aliens to recognize early warning signs, teaching them to act quickly and decisively if the cliffs showed signs of collapse. Slowly, areas that had once been abandoned were reclaimed and the people began to feel safe again. The rivers and floodplains were another challenge. Sudden rains could swell rivers overnight, washing away crops, bridges, and homes. The visitors studied the currents carefully, placing temporary barriers, creating diversion channels, and teaching local communities how to monitor water levels. They set up simple early warning systems using natural materials, showing the aliens that survival did not always require advanced technology. Sometimes, careful observation and quick action were more effective than any machine. The aliens eagerly followed their instructions, amazed at how quickly they could respond to crises with confidence rather than fear. Wildlife management became increasingly important as well. Some creatures, once considered pests, had grown aggressive due to environmental stress. The visitors handled these situations with care and intelligence. They neutralized threats without unnecessary harm and guided animals away from vulnerable areas. The aliens learned techniques to monitor behavior, predict danger, and take preventive measures. In doing so, they realized that survival was not about controlling everything. It was about understanding, respecting, and adapting to the environment. The visitors also focused on rebuilding and strengthening communities. Homes that had been destroyed by storms, floods, or landslides were repaired and fortified. Villages were reorganized to reduce risk, with streets and paths designed to avoid dangerous zones. The visitors taught efficient ways to share resources, store food safely, and manage energy in a world where conditions could change overnight. Slowly, a new sense of security took hold. The aliens began to see their world not just as a dangerous place to survive, but as a planet where careful planning and courageous action could make life possible and even prosperous. Education became an essential part of the process. The visitors worked alongside children and adults alike, showing them how to navigate hazards, detect early warning signs, and work together in teams. They taught not with lectures or manuals, but through demonstration, encouraging observation, imitation, and creativity. The aliens absorbed this knowledge quickly, learning that survival depended on action, flexibility, and courage as much as intelligence. Communities began to train themselves, building resilience that would last long after the visitors had moved on. One of the most remarkable aspects of the visitors was their ability to remain calm under pressure. When storms arrived suddenly, when cliffs trembled, or when volcanic tremors shook the ground, the visitors acted without fear or hesitation. Their calmness was contagious. The aliens noticed that panic decreased wherever the visitors were present. Villagers followed their guidance, moving quickly to safety, trusting their judgment. Slowly, fear began to lose its grip, replaced by confidence and clarity. The visitors had taught not only skills but also the mindset needed to survive and thrive in a dangerous world. Innovation became another critical tool. The visitors used what the planet offered, combining natural materials in clever ways to solve problems. Bridges, shelters, barriers, and warning systems were created with simple yet effective solutions that the aliens had never imagined. They demonstrated that intelligence and creativity could overcome danger, even when the odds seemed impossible. The aliens were amazed, realizing that survival was not only about strength but about thinking, adapting, and finding solutions in the moment. As days turned into weeks, the visitors moved deeper into the most extreme zones. Villages that had been cut off for decades were now connected by safe paths. Dangerous regions that had once been off limits were now accessible. Crops and water sources that had been under threat were stabilized. The visitors had not only prevented further destruction, they had reversed some of the damage, giving life back to areas that had long been abandoned. The aliens watched in awe as what had once seemed impossible became achievable. The influence of the visitors extended beyond physical survival. Their courage, determination, and resilience inspired the aliens to think differently about challenges. They saw that problems were not barriers to be feared, but opportunities to learn, adapt, and grow. Communities became more united, working together to protect one another. Children grew up learning to face danger with respect and awareness rather than fear and avoidance. The visitors had reshaped not only the land but also the mindset of its inhabitants. Even the alien leaders felt a profound change within themselves. They had always relied on careful planning, technology, and strict rules to manage crises. But the visitors showed them that courage, adaptability, and creativity could achieve results beyond any calculation. They learned to trust their instincts, to act decisively, and to embrace challenges rather than shy away from them. The planet was safer, stronger, and more resilient, and much of that change came from the example set by these extraordinary visitors. By the end of the 5th week, the planet was transformed in ways that had seemed impossible. Dangerous zones were stabilized, communities were secure, and resources were managed intelligently. The aliens had learned skills and mindsets that would serve them for generations. But more than that, they had been shown a new way of living in a world filled with risk, a way that combined courage, observation, adaptation, and teamwork. The visitors, though tireless, showed no signs of arrogance. They worked quietly, efficiently, and without complaint. Every action was aimed at improving survival, reducing risk, and teaching the aliens to take charge of their own future. Their humility, combined with unmatched skill, made them even more extraordinary. The aliens realized that they were witnessing not just survival in action, but a philosophy of life, one that could transform an entire civilization. As the sun set over mountains, rivers, and forests, the alien communities gathered to observe the progress. They reflected on how far they had come in just a few weeks. What had once been dangerous and impossible was now manageable. Fear had been replaced by understanding, despair by hope, and isolation by cooperation. The visitors had done more than save lives. They had shown the aliens how to live in harmony with a world that was both beautiful and dangerous. And yet, even as they celebrated these successes, the aliens understood that the journey was not over. The visitors had taught them the tools, the mindset, and the courage to face the future, but true mastery of survival required continued effort. The lessons learned in these weeks would guide the aliens, but the real test would be applying them on their own, in moments when the visitors were no longer present. The alien leaders looked to the horizon, imagining the journey the visitors had taken to reach them. They marveled at their resilience, skill, and determination. These beings had traveled through the unknown, faced dangers far greater than anything on the alien planet, and still arrived ready to act decisively. Their presence had changed the planet forever, and the aliens knew that their own civilization would never be the same. The visitors had proven that even the most extreme challenges could be overcome with courage, skill, teamwork, and careful observation. They had transformed not just the physical environment but the spirit of the planet's people. For the planet had changed in ways that the aliens could hardly believe. The arrival of the visitors had transformed not only the landscape, but the people themselves. Where fear had once ruled, courage now prevailed. Where despair had threatened to consume the communities, hope now flourished. The visitors had been tireless, guiding, teaching, and demonstrating how survival was possible even under the harshest conditions. And yet they did not linger unnecessarily. Their purpose was not to stay forever, but to leave the planet stronger than they had found it. The aliens watched as the visitors moved through villages, forests, and rivers one last time, checking that everything was stable. They observed quietly, aware that each action carried lessons far beyond the immediate repairs. Bridges were reinforced, food supplies carefully stored, and shelters fortified against storms. Water sources were protected, and warning systems were in place to alert communities to sudden dangers. It was a level of preparation that the aliens had never seen before, and they understood that the visitors had built resilience into every aspect of daily life. But the greatest impact was not in the structures or the systems, it was in the people themselves. Children who had once hidden in fear were now exploring cautiously, learning to move through the forest and rivers with awareness and respect. Adults who had hesitated for years now acted decisively when problems arose, using the techniques taught by the visitors. Communities had learned to work together, combining their knowledge, skill, and courage to face challenges that had once seemed impossible. The visitors had not just saved the planet, they had empowered its inhabitants. As the visitors prepared to depart, the aliens gathered to express their gratitude. Words were inadequate, but the feeling was clear. These beings had crossed unimaginable distances, faced dangers that no one on the planet could imagine, and changed the course of history for everyone. They had not sought recognition, reward, or praise. They had simply acted because it was the right thing to do. Their presence had been a lesson in humility, courage, and action, and the aliens were determined to honor it by continuing the work that had been begun. The departure was quiet, but profound. The visitors moved with the same careful efficiency that had marked their arrival. They ensured that all communities were prepared, that warning systems were functional, and that the aliens had the skills to respond to any future challenges. Then, without fanfare, they left the planet, slipping back into the depths of space as if they had never been there. And yet their impact remained, visible in the repaired villages, the flourishing fields, the safe rivers, and most importantly, in the transformed hearts and minds of the planet's people. The aliens spent the first days after their departure reflecting on what had occurred. They realized that their civilization had been on the brink of collapse, facing dangers that seemed insurmountable. Yet in just a few weeks, the visitors had shown them a new way to live. The planet was no longer a place to fear. It was a place where careful observation, courage, teamwork, and adaptability could turn danger into opportunity. The lessons were clear. Survival was not just about knowledge or technology, but about action, resilience, and understanding one's environment. As time passed, the aliens began to apply the lessons they had learned. They improved monitoring systems for storms, floods, and volcanic activity, combining the visitors' methods with their own technology. Communities began to teach one another, passing down the techniques, strategies, and mindset that had been demonstrated. Children grew up learning to move through dangerous areas with care, to respect wildlife, and to act decisively in emergencies. A culture of preparedness and resilience took root, ensuring that the planet would never again be caught unprepared. The visitors' influence also inspired innovation. The aliens began to experiment with new methods, building on the principles they had learned. They created tools and systems that were simple but effective, combining instinct, observation, and ingenuity. They developed shelters that could withstand storms, bridges that could survive floods, and irrigation systems that preserved water even in dry seasons. Each innovation was a direct result of the mindset the visitors had instilled, that challenges could be solved with courage, creativity, and action. Even the social fabric of the planet changed. Communities that had once been isolated learned to work together, sharing resources, knowledge, and skills. Conflicts over territory, food, or water diminished as cooperation became a stronger survival strategy than competition. The visitors had demonstrated that teamwork was more powerful than individual effort, and the aliens embraced this lesson fully. Villages collaborated on building projects, shared early warning systems, and trained each other in survival techniques. The planet was not only safer, it was stronger, more connected, and more resilient than ever before. The aliens also reflected on the courage of the visitors. They had faced dangers that were unimaginable, volcanic eruptions, deadly predators, extreme storms, and had done so with calm, decisiveness, and skill. It was not just their strength that impressed the aliens, but their mindset. Fear did not dictate action, hesitation did not paralyze, and uncertainty was met with careful observation and adaptation. The aliens realized that this mindset, more than any physical tool, was the key to survival. As months passed, the planet continued to heal. Areas that had been devastated by natural disasters now supported thriving communities. Rivers flowed steadily, forests were healthier, and wildlife was balanced within the ecosystem. Crops grew reliably, and trade between communities flourished. The lessons of the visitors had taken root, not only in infrastructure and systems, but in the culture and mentality of the planet itself. The aliens understood that they had been given more than help. They had been given a new way of life. The alien leaders looked to the stars often, imagining the journey the visitors had taken to reach them. They wondered what other worlds these beings had touched, what other civilizations had been strengthened by their courage and skill. The visitors had acted without recognition, without expectation of reward, and yet their impact was immeasurable. The aliens realized that the universe was far larger and more complex than they had known, and that there were beings shaped by challenge, forged by danger, and capable of extraordinary action. The final lesson was perhaps the most profound. Survival depended not only on strength or knowledge, but on the willingness to act, to learn, and to adapt. The visitors had shown the aliens that even in the harshest conditions, life could thrive when courage, skill, and cooperation were combined. They had transformed fear into confidence, despair into hope, and isolation into community. The planet had survived its greatest threats, and its people had been changed forever. And so life moved forward. The planet's inhabitants faced new challenges, as all worlds do, but they were no longer afraid. They had learned how to face danger with intelligence and courage, how to act decisively, and how to work together for the greater good. The visitors' presence was no longer needed. They had done their work, but their lessons remained, embedded in the land, the communities, and the people themselves. The aliens often spoke of the visitors with reverence, not as heroes or conquerors, but as teachers and guides. They had arrived when all hope seemed lost, faced dangers no one else would dare confront, and left the planet stronger than it had ever been. Their influence endured, visible in every repaired home, every safe bridge, every flourishing field, and every confident child moving through the forests and rivers. Generations later, the story of the visitors became legend. It was told not only as a tale of survival, but as a lesson in courage, adaptability, and the power of action. Children learned that fear could be managed, challenges could be overcome, and life could be transformed by those who had the skill and determination to act decisively. Communities continued to thrive, and the planet itself flourished in ways that had once seemed impossible. And so, the aliens understood the true meaning of their distress call. It had been a cry for help, yes, but it had also been an opportunity for transformation, for learning, and for growth. The visitors had answered, not with hesitation or caution, but with courage, skill, and the determination to face any danger. They had changed the planet forever, and in doing so, they had left a legacy that would endure for generations. The planet was no longer a place defined by fear or fragility. It was a place of resilience, strength, and hope. The aliens had learned to face challenges with courage, to act decisively, and to work together in harmony with their world. The visitors had departed, but their lessons remained, guiding every decision, every action, and every step forward. The planet had survived its greatest threats, and its people had been transformed. Life would continue, stronger and wiser, forever shaped by the extraordinary beings who had come when all seemed lost.